This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 323 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's about language learning through travel and immersion. I guess that's probably the best way to learn a language. It's certainly the most fun. And I've got a bunch of guests today who have had these kind of experiences. Firstly, I'd like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation where I'm recording this podcast. I must say that very, very slowly over the years, over my lifetime, more Noongar words are slowly becoming known here. But I hope that one day this really accelerates and we know a lot more about the original language of our area. Now, speaking of learning languages through travel and immersion, I guess the only language that I managed to do this relatively successfully with was German when I lived there. And even then, it was only when I had a German boyfriend and his German friends. Before that, not so much. And I also didn't learn via immersion when I was living in Slovakia and Japan. And in all of these cases, the biggest reason was because I worked speaking English all day. I was teaching English. I was required to not speak the local languages. And generally speaking, also, the local friends that I made spoke much better Slovak or much better Japanese, especially Slovak, much better. So it was really interesting to chat with this episode's guests about their language learning experiences because they were really successful through various combinations of travel and immersion that were different to mine. So, first up, I chat with Paddy Jenkins from Thai Travels with Paddy. Now, I've travelled in Thailand to Bangkok and Chiang Mai with Paddy, so I have seen and heard firsthand how good his Thai is. And so I asked him to explain for you all how he achieved this. But he actually starts off with a very important, I guess, thoughtful travel kind of point.
It's interesting when I get asked about this question, Thai, because so many people around the world learn English and other languages as their second languages, and they're not the ones coming on podcasts, but it just so happens that it's a bit more rare to see a Caucasian guy learning Thai, so it becomes a little bit more impressive or people want to know about it a bit more. But I think the exact same amount of effort goes into a lot of people learning English and we don't recognize that. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. So I first lived in Thailand in 2014. I moved across there without knowing anything about Asia. I'd never been to Thailand before. I didn't know a single word of the language. I went across there as a volunteer English teacher, as essentially a gap year in my time between high school and university. And I was stationed in a very small village outside of Chiang Mai in a time where internet was not a thing. The village didn't have any internet. I didn't have an iPhone. I look back on that as an extreme positive because it left me with nothing but a $10 dictionary that I bought from a local bookstore. Ended up being the best $10 I ever spent. And I just hammered into the Thai language. I just got fully stuck into it through a period of about 9 months to a year, fully immersed myself in this village. I lived in a dormitory with only Thai students at the local high school, which meant no English was being spoken really unless I was teaching English. But in my day-to-day, I was always using Thai. So I remember going for periods of up to 3 weeks, 4 weeks where I didn't speak a word of English, which is just crazy to think about looking back. I was 17 or 18 and just kind of taking the bull by the horns in regards to living in a foreign country, completely immersing myself. All my friends were Thai and I had to kind of just extricate myself from my Australian mindset and fully acculturate into the place, and the only way to do that was to learn Thai. So I would study every day for about 2 hours by myself at night. I'd just write new vocabulary and then go out and use it. I would take this little book everywhere I went, even to like clubs. I remember going to clubs as an 18-year-old in Chiang Mai and taking out my little notepad and like writing down the word for like dance or 2 beers, please, or whatever it was. And so my whole life was surrounded by it. I think it came from initially it was kind of like what to do, and I just started learning it for the sake of it. And then very quickly it turned into this love. I'd never loved learning something so much. I'd studied high school just the year before, and I'd studied languages, subjects like maths, English, history, whatever, and they were okay. But then I started learning Thai and putting it into practice on a day-to-day basis, and I felt it was the first time where I really enjoyed studying something. So that was kind of my journey. And then from there, I kind of returned to Australia, did university, and I've worked, and I've just tried to keep it up. And then through starting YouTube in 2019, which is a long time between when I first learned it and started YouTube, right? I have been able to improve it even more, develop it even more, understand the language in more depth, the complexities of it. And now it's a pretty decent resource for Thai learners on the internet.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's quite phenomenal. And I just love that the way you taught yourself was, a notebook and a dictionary, because that's a really hard way to do it, and yet very successful in your case.
Yeah, I didn't do any formal lessons really. So that's probably there's been some shortcomings there, I think, with my language proficiency. I don't fully understand the intricacies and some of the structural elements as well as, say, if someone had learned in a formal language learning class. But I think my general degree of fluency, my accent, and the way I use Thai in day-to-day is it's quite a decent level. I would never probably say fluent, but it's quite highly proficient. So yeah, it's been amazing. I think learning a language makes you see the world in a completely different way. I think it's a shame in Australia how little emphasis we place on learning second languages. I think it gives you a great sense of empathy for other people, a great sense of patience, and allows you to understand what it's like for so many people who don't speak English as a first language, to what it feels like to move to a new place, to consume English media like we do. It's all wrapped into that. And I feel like by learning Thai, I've been given a sense of empathy as to what it's like to be an alien in a situation and what it's like to not understand something. So yeah, I'm passionate about this topic.
I totally agree. It's a real problem in English-speaking countries that we don't seem to prioritise learning other languages in any meaningful way, certainly not in how I've seen it during my lifetime in Australia. Perhaps it's even worse in a country like Australia. There's a real expectation that our immigrants will learn English quickly, and we're a pretty large and isolated country we don't even have a border with other countries. So that kind of experience of hearing foreign languages is a bit rarer in some ways, or at least, maybe the experience of having to use a foreign language is rarer. It's a problem, and I wish everyone really had that proper experience of learning other languages, because as Paddy says, this makes a huge difference to how you understand other people. Anyway, my next guest is Tracy Collins of the Global Travel Planning podcast, and she tells us the remarkable way in which she really quickly learnt to speak French fluently.
I went to school in the UK until I was 13, and then we immigrated. So in the UK, you have to learn French. So I had what nobody wants, a teacher who did not inspire any confidence in her pupils. Ugh. And I was told, I think I was about 11 at the time, that I would never be able to speak French. And I remember thinking, well, you know what? One day I will speak French because
you said I couldn't, so.
And I can't do. So when I finished university and moved to France in 1989, beginning of 1989. Now, I finished university, I was in South Africa, and I finished my last year of university and decided, okay, I'm going to move to France and I'm going to learn French and I'm going to live with a French family. So I did, in my final year of university, I did an additional course, which was an introduction to French, because after I'd moved to South Africa, I'd not done French again. So the French that I did know had gone. So I did this introductory course in French. Now, moved to France in January 1989, and within 6 months I was fluent in French.
No way.
Yeah, not only was I fluent in French, I was thinking in French. I actually struggled. This is going to sound crazy when I say this, but my dad phoned me up and I actually struggled to speak in English because all I had done was speak in French. Now the key to this, and I always thank Jack for this, is Jack, who was the father of the two girls that I was looking after as an au pair. He was very keen that my French was good, so that his daughters did not pick up bad French. So basically, I remember for the first week walking around with a dictionary, because honestly, I'd done 12 months, a kind of intense course, but it was still basic French. Yeah. Walking around with the dictionary probably for about the first month. Every conversation I had, Jack would correct my French, which was hard, right? And I remember some of the other au pairs coming over and going, oh, I don't know how you put up with that. He's always correcting your French. And I went, there's a reason why he's correcting French, because he wants Emily and Chloe to speak good French. He doesn't want them to pick up something from me, that because they were 4 and 8 at the time. So because he did that, And because I was fully immersed in French. So, okay, yes, there were a couple of au pairs. I didn't meet Suzanne, who I have just spoken to you about, was my good friend that I met the following year because I stayed in the ski resort for 18 months. At that point, there was only a couple of other au pairs. There was a Canadian girl and an English girl, but I didn't spend as much time with them, obviously, as I was spending with the family and with the kids. So I was just immersed in French the entire time. So within 6 months, that was it. I'm still proud of that to this day.
Oh, you should be. Yeah.
So my French now is a little bit rusty. Certainly, it's something that we talk about doing, going back to so I can spend some time in France. When we lived in Europe, I used to do that a bit more. And I remember we hired a gite. I'm trying to think where we were in the Dordogne, actually. We had, and I actually said to them when I arrived, I speak a little bit of French. It was actually an Australian couple who'd bought this sheet, and for some reason, I had to make a phone call to something. I think it was some sorting out trains or something. So I spoke in French, and obviously the lady could hear me outside. And she kept, I thought you said you could only speak a little bit of French. I didn't know you were fluent. And I'm like, well, it's not as good as it used to be. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you really want to do something, the best way to do it is to go there, if you can, immerse yourself in it, because you know what, you will learn it. So as I say, like I'm trying to keep, there's a lot of words I don't remember now. I can't think in French. I'm not as fluent in my head as I was.
But you could always find when you've forgotten a word, you can always explain around it if you need to. Yeah. So, you can still communicate.
Yeah, I still want to be where I was, and I'm not kind of where I was. So at some point we will get back to France, and I'll get some time. It may take 6 months of pushing myself.
Absolute hats off to Tracy for that immersion travel experience. I think learning French is pretty difficult. My son learnt French for a few years in school, and I tried to follow along, and I found it really hard. But even harder, I think, is Polish, and that's the language my next guest learnt. Thomas Swick moved to Poland after following his Polish girlfriend there. And I know Polish has a lot of similarities with Slovak, which I did try to learn for the first 6 months. I had lessons from the school I was teaching in for the first 6 months. I lived in Bratislava. I found the grammar exceedingly difficult. But Thomas did manage to pick up Polish, and here is how.
I started studying Polish as soon as I knew I was going to Poland. So I took an evening class in New Jersey where I was working for a newspaper. And I was struck by the fact that Polish is an inflected language, with different cases. So words change depending on how they're used in a sentence. So you can't really say even a simple sentence in Polish without making a mistake. And the example I always use is the word for dog. It's spelled Pies, and it's pronounced a bit like French PS. But if you say you have a dog, it's psa. And if you go for a walk with your dog, it's psem. And if you give your dog a bone, it's psu. And if you want to describe your dog, the adjectives change. And, God help you if you have two dogs, because plural is a whole nother thing. And so it's basically you have to not just learn the new word, but you have to learn the same word in different contexts. And that made it very difficult. The other thing is the pronunciation. Mm-hmm. It is full of consonants. I call them in my book alphabet ending consonant clots. And they just, they make pronunciation really hard for especially somebody who as an English speaker. We don't have that. I will say this, though, and my wife, who is Polish, is always pointing this out. Once you know the alphabet and how letters are pronounced, you can look at any Polish word and know exactly how it's pronounced.
Yes.
There's nothing like we have in English where Rough is pronounced completely different from Dough.
Exactly.
It doesn't happen in Polish. And every letter in a Polish word has a reason to be there. Mm-hmm. Even in my wife's name is Hanna, and it's double N, and you kind of pronounce both of those N's. Mm-hmm. So there is a certain logic to that. But when I got to Poland the first time, I lived there for 6 months, I made very little progress with Polish. My wife, my girlfriend at the time, spoke English. We met in London, so English was our language. But when I came back, I came back to Poland in 1980, and if you know, that was the beginning of the Solidarity movement, which was this free trade union that started in Gdansk, and then it soon carried throughout the country. It really became a big political movement, and really, it was the beginning of the end of communism in Eastern Europe. In 1980, that started. So I arrived like just a few weeks after that started. And people were having intense discussions. They were reading the newspapers, debating what they read. And like any normal person, I wanted to know what was being talked about. I wanted to know what was happening around me. So that made me, I think, even more, it gave me more incentive to learn the language quicker. And I did. I'd make lists of vocabulary words. One thing I found very helpful, this was before a lot of audio technology. So a lot of my language learning was reading the written word. And one thing I discovered, I started reading screenplays. I found a book of screenplays from a Polish director who I'd seen some of his movies, and they were very contemporary movies about, everyday life. And those were great because that's the language that people speak. Much easier than reading a novel or even a play, because plays can be kind of didactic. But the screenplays were really helpful. Another thing, I watched a lot of TV, and there was a thing in Poland where they had, every once in a while they'd show Russian films. And they would have a speaker who would speak the dialogue in Polish, and then they'd have the subtitles of what he was saying. So I could hear the words and see them written at the same time.
Perfect.
It was. And I'd sit there during the movies with a pen and pencil, and I'd write down the words I didn't understand. Then I saw them on the screen. And then after the movie, I'd go look them up in the dictionary and add them to my list. So, that was the way I learned.
Yeah, chatting with Thomas reminded me, actually, when I lived in Bratislava, obviously right next to Austria, very close to the border, we could also pick up German language TV channels, Austrian channels. And I spent many an evening watching Friends dubbed into German, and I kept a list of words or vocabulary and phrases that I wanted to look up. And as Thomas explained as well, when he was talking about screenplays, there was a lot of really everyday language in Friends, and it helped me convert my sort of schoolgirl German into modern, this is how people actually speak to each other German. So that was a really good tip. Now, my final guest today is Pam Petro, and we're chatting about learning Welsh. Now, you might remember from episode 322 that Pam moved to Wales for postgrad study, but it actually wasn't until later that she seriously studied Welsh, and her immersion method was different again.
There was a moment when I was a grad student in Wales when I was in a pub. I spent a lot of time in pubs, and this was a pub right over the line from in Cuman, the next village from Lampeter, and I was with a bunch of people, and someone said, "Oh, there's a fair coming up in Llanbedr upon Steffan."
Sorry, where?
Llanbedr upon Steffan. Where's that? I said, I don't know that place. And everybody laughed, everybody in the pub, because Llanbedr upon Steffan is the Welsh name of Lampeter.
Oh.
And Lampeter means nothing. It's an anglicized word that has no meaning.
Right.
And Llanbedr upon Steffan means Llanbedr, Peter's Church, Pont Steffan at Stephen's Bridge.
Full of meaning.
Full of meaning. And I was ashamed and horrified. And I thought, oh my gosh, these place names that I can't decipher hold not just clues to the past, but whole worlds. They paint pictures of places that are now vanished. It's like these names are full of ghosts. Ghosts as people and buildings and landscapes. Oh, belief systems and all kinds of things. And if I want to feel at home here, I've got to know this. So it was the place names that pulled me down and into the desire to learn this language. During my master's degree, which was in the English department, I didn't even see that as an irony.
True.
And I should say here, the Welsh language is to choose to learn Welsh, even if you don't understand this, you're making a political decision because Welsh is more so than for any other Celtic nation. It's the banner of Welshness. Wales has held on to its language far more than any other Celtic nation. And there are all kinds of reasons for that I won't get into. But it has 18% of Welsh people who live in Wales speak Welsh now. But that is, around the turn of the 20th century, it was, I don't know the percentage, it might have been 80%.
Right.
And a lot of factors drove that down. But some of those factors were things like wearing the Welsh knot, which is children going to school from around 1850 up to 1950, in some cases, some isolated cases still in the 1950s, were forced to speak English and listen to lessons in English, even though they didn't speak it. And if they were heard speaking Welsh, they had to wear this string around their necks with a piece of wood on it that said not, meaning I will not speak Welsh. And the child who was wearing it at the end of the day was beaten in front of the class.
Oh, gosh.
And the students were encouraged to tell on each other if they heard Welsh being spoken. And it's just heartbreaking.
So sad. Yeah, wow.
So when you stand up and say, I want to speak Welsh, I want to do this, it's in honor of so many things and so many people from whom it was literally beaten out.
Yes, literally, gosh.
So I decided I wanted to learn Welsh. And if going to study word and image theory in a small town in West Wales wasn't bad enough, as in, my parents' friends saying, what's that going to do for you? Yeah. To their credit, my parents did not say that. They said, if that's what you want to do, we'll support you.
Nice.
I went, 9 years later, I spent the summer learning Welsh. It was on what was called the Ulpan course, which no longer exists. But Ulpan is a Hebrew word that means studio. And it's the way the Israeli government taught people to speak Hebrew. The Israeli army, not the government, taught people to speak Hebrew fast.
Oh, okay.
So they could understand directions in the army. And so the same techniques were applied. And we had to sign an affidavit when we started that said something like, intensive language learning can be detrimental to your health. Like the sort of thing you'd see on a package of cigarettes.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
I thought, oh, no.
What have I signed up for?
Oh, my God. And it was brutal. It was 7 days a week, just speaking Welsh all day, every day. It was hard. It was in the same town of Lampeter where I had studied. Somewhere at some point, I was trying to speak to my friends who were Welsh speaking, and they would always say the same thing. Why do you want to speak Welsh to us when we all speak English? You're only here for 2.5 months. Let's actually get to know each other rather than, you and I talk about the pen of my aunt is on the mountain, that kind of thing that you learn in language classes. So I got this crazy idea that I would go learn Welsh where English wasn't spoken. I wrote an essay later after that summer for a Welsh literary magazine and put as a bio, Pamela Petra would like to travel around the world speaking Welsh.
Nice.
And the editorial director of Flamingo, which was an imprint at HarperCollins at the time, had just been given a subscription to this magazine for Christmas.
Oh, wow.
And he wrote me and said, that sounds like a travel book. And that was the background to my first book, Travels in an Old Tongue, which I literally, my partner Marguerite and I, traveled the world in 5 months, except for Australia, I'm sorry to say. But we went throughout Europe and Asia and South America talking to Japanese academics who I couldn't converse with in Japanese, but they had learned Welsh because they were enchanted with Celtic languages.
Wow.
And I had to use Welsh as a universal language. And that's how I came the closest to learning Welsh. And it was fantastically painful and difficult, and we were poor, and it was awful.
And yet.
I don't know. And yet. There were good moments. But it was brutally hard. And so that's how I learned Welsh.
Oh,
which
my goodness.
I came home and spent another 5 months or 6 months or more writing the book and only speaking English. I wrote the book in English. And by the time I finished it, I'd forgotten a lot of the Welsh.
Oh, no.
So I can still speak it a little. I can read it a lot better.
Okay.
But it was just a bizarre route to language learning.
So Pam's learning of Welsh was not quite as successful, but it involved some very interesting immersion and travel, which I found was just such an interesting story. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to episode 323 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. A bunch of interesting links and rabbit holes for you to wander down from my guests today. First of all, Thai Talk with Paddy is Paddy Jenkins' YouTube channel. Just search for Thai Talk with Paddy in YouTube. Lots of really interesting videos that you'll find there, including what I like is often he'll chat with just ordinary Thai people. A recent one was including chats with Thai taxi drivers. And, it's a really cool way to learn more about, how Thailand really operates. And you'll be able to see for yourself that Paddy can speak Thai really, really, really well. After that, I chatted with Tracy Collins. She has 2 podcasts, the UK Travel Planning podcast and the Global Travel Planning podcast, and websites for them, uktravelplanning.com and globaltravelplanning.com. I then chatted with Thomas Swick, and you can find out more about Thomas at his website, Thomas Swick, that's SWICK.com, and his new book, Falling Into Place. And last but definitely not least, I chatted with Pam Petro. You can find out more about Pam's work at pamelapetro.com. And Pam's book, The Long Field, is her newest book about whales and, so many beautiful concepts about whales. I'm going to talk about it some more in another episode, but there'll be a link to that in the show notes as well. And if you are particularly interested in languages, another episode I recorded a little while back, episode 277 on languages and connection and, kind of the value of learning languages for travelling purposes. So you can find that anywhere you listen to podcasts or notaballerina.com/277. Don't forget, come and join Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers or sign up for the newsletter at Substack, thoughtfultravel.substack.com. And all of these links, of course, will be in the show notes for this episode. They're at notaballerina.com/323. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.